we happy to start now? We've waited a few more. It does look like we've got a few more people here, so it's always nice to see everybody this morning. Just to let you know, I am facilitating this morning on behalf of Family Voice Peterborough. Just to let you know, Katie Blessett was going to be joining us, but Michelle and Rachel will be covering the presentation this morning. We are recording this, so we will be able to watch it later on YouTube. And so it's your option. If you want to stay on camera, you can do. Or alternatively, switch your camera off, but do remember, please, to switch off your microphone. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use your hands up button. I know Michelle and Rachel are going to be monitoring the chat. And if at the end of the presentation or at the end of the meeting, if you have any feedback that you'd like to offer us, there will be an opportunity for a QR code. If you just scan that with your phone at the end of the meeting, we can deal with that for you. And hopefully you've all put your food orders in, because there are refreshments. So very exciting. It's worth coming just for that, to be honest. So over to you, Michelle and Rachel.
Thank you very much. So you can see I'm Michelle Milner. I'm one of the Statutory Assessment and Monitoring Officers, specifically for transitions within the local authority. My background is actually in primary and secondary, being a SENCO. And secondly, we have Rachel here today. So I'll let Rachel introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Dunge, another one of the Statutory Assessment and Monitoring that works alongside me in the transition team. And I'm just trying to think, actually, I've been in the team 5 years, I think, been within this service for now.
I do think you keep breaking up, Rachel, or you do for myself. So hopefully
it keeps my mic's not stable or something, so apologies.
No problem. What I'm going to do, just to help with the connection, I'm now going to stop the video for myself so we can just focus on the PowerPoint. I'm just going to stop my, there we are. Okay, so the PowerPoint that we've got here for you today is around annual reviews of the education, health and care plans themselves. Now, as a transition team, we are responsible for training within Peterborough, and we do offer a level 2 training session for all professionals within educational settings, and we also hold level 2 training for health and social care. What you're going to be seeing today is actually part of the presentation that was delivered to SENCOs. So it's really useful for you guys as parents to fully understand the information that SENCOs have, the process, the statutory deadlines. So we're going to go through this. So some parts you might think, well, that's more relevant for SENCOs, but actually it's useful for you to know it as well. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. Again, just a little bit of virtual housekeeping, sorry. So please put your mic on mute, but if you want to actually ask a question, please do so at any point. I know you can raise your hand up, I believe, in Zoom. Myself and Rachel are very familiar with Teams, not so much in Zoom. But please do let us know if you have any questions. But we'll also be stopping quite frequently to give people that chance to have those open discussions. Okay, so like we said about the level 2 training session, there are 3 of us in the transition team. Josie sent her apologies today, but you do have myself and Rachel. And Katie Blessett, Head of Service, might be popping in a bit later. Actually, a quick warm-up really. What percentage of pupils in England do you think has an education, health and care plan based on the last January 2021 data? It's in January every year that the data is collated and put together. So any ideas? If you're not too sure, let's have a quick look. It's quite an interesting one. And this is something we always ask SENCOs, healthcare professionals and social care professionals, because it's really important that people understand that it's roughly only about 3.7% of pupils in schools in England have an education, health and care plan. A lot of people actually think it should be higher, but this is the national average, and it is increasing. We know back in 2019 it was 3.1. 2020 it did rise to 3.3, but it currently, based on the last January data, It's sitting nationally at 3.7. Now, in Peterborough, that equates to the fact that we have around 2,167 children. Now, that's based on data from about, I think, 2 months ago. So I would anticipate that's higher now already. And a lot of people are quite shocked when they think, 2,000 people within a small local authority like Peterborough. That's a lot of plans that the local authority are processing on a daily basis. Next slide talks about what is an annual review then of education, health and social care plans. You might see it abbreviated to EHC plans or EHCPs, but thinking about what is it? Now, there is actually the name annual, so it's a yearly review. So it talks about here the requirements by the local authorities is to ensure that every plan is reviewed at least annually, so that's at least within 12 months of the either initial plan or of the last annual review. And the code of practice here talks about, actively monitoring children, actively talking to families, looking at the long-term aspirations, linking it to outcomes. Now, when you see anything in italics in this presentation, these are actually quotes from something called the SEND Code of Practice. If you want to look at the document yourself, the numbers next to each quote will indicate the chapter and the point in the actual document. So this one comes from chapter 9.166. You can quite easily look up those for yourself if you wish to. Now, that code of practice, as well as the Children and Families Act, are the key documents for SENCOs to fully understand. It is something that they are very familiar with, or should be very familiar with. And we always talk to SENCOs about, quotes from the code of practice. This is what the statutory process is.
The code of practice is quite long, isn't it, Michelle? It's 292 pages long, so it's a very long document with lots of bits for lots of kind of different people to see in it. So so we tend to pull bits out of it that we use quite a lot on kind of a day-to-day, and different professionals use different parts of it because there's lots and lots of information. It kind of covers all different circumstances. So, for example, youngsters that might be in custody with an EHCP. So the code of practice really kind of tries to cover each sort of part that might apply to a child or young person that has got an education and healthcare plan or is going through the process for one.
Thank you, Rachel. Absolutely. That is the key document, and every SENCO will have a copy within their school and access to that document, as it is the statutory process. Okay, so again, we've spoken about, it is annually, so it is 12 monthly, but I'm going to show you this white box. This is actually at the end of any education, health and care plan. You can see, looking at your child's plan, that we do state that it is annually, so it is a minimum every 12 months. We're talking about the review meeting being held at least 8 weeks in advance of the date. So we're looking at, looking at a yearly process and planning out when that annual review should be. And the short-term targets should be met by the educational provider themselves. So in the plan, you've got these longer-term end of key stage outcomes, but the school should still have short-term targets that they should be reviewing 3 times at least termly with you as a family, as well as then having the addition of the annual review itself. Now, there are some actual reasons why an EHC plan might be reviewed more often. If we're looking at 0 to 5 years, the code of practice talks about having a review every 3 to 6 months. Because if you're working within that 0 to 5 year range, things progress, things change rather rapidly. Now, that review could be every 6 months, or it might be every 3 months based on that child individually. Another reason, which we don't often hear about, but it is important to know, is something we call a transfer in. So that's talking about a family that might have moved into Peterborough. So even if they've moved into Peterborough and they might have had an annual review in the previous local authority, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months before, we would naturally have a review within 3 months of that transfer into Peterborough to review the plan, as well as then update and transfer it onto a Peterborough format. So if you live, for example, in Cambridgeshire, you'll have a Cambridgeshire EHCp. If you move across the border into Peterborough, the format of the plan will change onto a Peterborough format. Another reason might be the needs of the young person might have significantly changed. You might have updated medical or social care advice, and the plan needs to be fit for purpose. So there might be a reason there to actually hold an interim review, an early review, to update the plan. That is talking about significant changes. Another one which families do need to know about is that if you do want to request an educational change of placement and your child has an EHCp, the change of placement is requested through a review of the Education, Health and Care Plan. So you might find yourself having to have an early review because it's at that point the plan is updated and you will get a notice of amend sent back to you, an amended plan, and with that you will get a form that you complete to say whether you agree with the plan and as well as what school you would like your child to go to. And the last reason on this PowerPoint is actually transition year groups. Now, when we think of transition year groups, we're thinking about year 2 in infant school only because they're transitioning to a new school. We're thinking about, the transition from primary to secondary. And in both of those situations, the plans, we have a statutory deadline of finalising those plans with the next educational placement by the 15th of February. So for some year groups, for example, a year 5 child may have a review at the beginning of the year because that's when their annual review is due. But as a local authority, we ask for an additional review to happen in the summer term so we can process, update the plan and have it finalised before the 15th of February with their secondary school placement. And the same goes for secondary to post-16. The deadline is different there. The deadline for that transition is the 31st of March. But in those cases, some year 11s might have, for example, a slightly earlier review because we need to meet the statutory deadlines.
So there's a really big emphasis from our team, isn't there, Michelle, on making sure that children and families that have got, children in those transition year groups have got all the information about sort of secondary options. So it feels like we do it really far in advance, but obviously we want to ensure that families and youngsters have all been able to sort of visit if they're looking at college placements. So it feels like we do it really far in advance, but obviously it's a big decision to make for any child that's going through that sort of phase of education, but particularly for children with EHCPs, we want to make sure that their next settings are sort of aware of the child or young person need and what their needs are, what provision and things they'll need to be putting in place. So that's why it's done so early, and obviously those legal deadlines are there to make sure that all families have got sort of those placements so they can prepare children that might need lots of preparation for moving. So those deadlines are really key and something that we as a team work really closely with settings and families to make sure sort of everybody's got that support or pointing them in the direction of support that they need to make sure that we do get those arrangements made for those particular groups of children and young people.
And an additional point to raise there, actually, because if your child is in a transition year group and you're attending the review, you will find that all the outcomes are changed until the next end of key stage. So if you attend a summer term year 5 review, we will be asking the schools to change the outcomes to the end of key stage 3. Now, the reason for that is because we use that plan to consult with the secondary schools. And the secondary schools need to know what that child is going to be working on long term, what the provision is needed within the plan to meet the outcome. So it is important that the plans are updated with new outcomes that are for the next key stage.
One thing we've also started to encourage is that if a family know which secondary school they want, for example, to look at if that Senko from the other school can join the annual review, and then they can sort of talk about, what they sort of provide in their school, what sort of provisions they use, or you know, ideas of what things can look like at secondary school as the children and young people are getting older and the provision might change slightly for them. So that's one thing that we do try and encourage, if families know you know, what secondary school, for example, they might want to go to, that's something that can be arranged by the SENCOs from primary to secondary.
And I think what you will find as well with some SENCOs is that even if a family aren't too sure about what secondary school placement they want their child to go to, you know, actually inviting the local catchment secondary school SENCO along. Your child might not necessarily end up at that school, you might choose another one, but actually having that input from a secondary perspective SENCO is actually really useful when you're looking at outcomes and provision. Okay, so we'll move on to the time frames for an annual review. It is really important you know what we're talking to our SENCOs about, because we're asking SENCOs to make sure that they're setting the date and time of these annual reviews and inviting professionals, you know, ideally at least 6 weeks before the annual review. Now that sounds like a long time, but actually we're asking SENCOs to ensure they request advice from professionals, and all the advice needs to be sent out 2 weeks before the annual review happens. So actually that doesn't give the professionals long to write that advice and make sure it gets back to the SENCO. But if they know about it 6 weeks before, then that will give them that extra time just to maybe book in that conversation, or it might even be to go into the school and do an observation, or it might just be, you know, talking to the family. But it does give them time then to actually write the revised advice and get it to the schools, because the schools are being asked to send out another proper invitation. So really confirming the date and time with all the information, advice to everybody attending the meeting at least 2 weeks before the annual review. So as a family, you should get, for example, a copy of a school report or the school advice. If you've got other professionals involved, you should get a copy of their advice. And the school should actually be asking you before the review about your views and have that recorded. So everybody that attends the meeting gets to see all the documentation before the annual review itself. Now, the annual review meeting itself, we do ask SENCOs to complete fully what we class as a Section L. A Section L is just some paperwork that is basically minutes of the meeting. So it will talk about the discussions around the progress towards the current outcomes. It will talk about whether there's any discussion around transition, around new outcomes. And we ask them to annotate the EHC plan. So all schools have a copy that they can annotate for the local authority that they can send in to us. So we can see what proposed changes are being made. Now, after the annual review, the settings do have 2 weeks to get all of that advice, the Section L, the annotated plan, back to the local authority. Now, as soon as the local authority receive that paperwork, we look at everything and consider whether amendments are actually needed, whether they're not needed, as well as whether ceasing the plan is required. That is something that will always be considered. So all three options will be considered. That information about the local authority's decision will be sent to the families within a letter within 4 weeks of the annual review date itself. So you will get a copy that will tell you whether the local authority is taking it further and will make the amendments, whether they don't feel any amendments are needed, or whether they're proposing ceasing the plan. Now, if the local authority do agree that amendments are needed, we will then give that paperwork to the allocated casework officer. Every school has an allocated casework officer as well as a transition officer. So if, for example, if your child is in year 5 or year 6 in primary, that will go to the transition officer, because we'll be looking at transitioning to the next stage of education. And if you're in secondary, year 9, 10 and 11 will be the responsibility of the transition officer, and all other year groups will be the responsibility of the statutory assessment and monitoring officer. Now, that officer will complete the notice of amend, so they will make the amendments to the plan the local authority feel is needed, based on all the advice, based on the section L, as well as looking at the annotated plan, those proposed changes. And we will write to you and give you a copy of that notice of amends, the annotated plan that we feel details the amendments needed. And parents have 15 days to respond to the local authority to state whether they agree with those changes, as well as what school they would like their child to go to. Now, that might be just to stay at the current school, or if it's a transition year group, we would be looking at what secondary school, what post-16 placement would be requested. And if at any time you did want to change your child's education, we would be looking at having that stated on that form. And that's why an annual review is needed, or a review of the education health care plan is needed if you are thinking about a change of placement. Now, if you do have concerns, if you're looking at that notice of amends and you think, do you know what, I don't actually agree with that, or I don't think that's worded appropriately, then you can have those conversations with that casework officer, and further amendments can be made at that point. Okay, so you could have that conversation either over the phone or in a virtual meeting with your allocated casework officer. So once we've got the notice of amends, and once the family have actually agreed to the notice of amends and have requested the next educational placement, or, you know, if they want a special school, it can be requested at that point as well. If you do request a special school placement, just to let you know, it does go to an SEN panel to consider, and any results of that panel will be fed back to you via your casework officer and in written form. But if you are looking at like a transition to secondary school, just to let you know, we do consult with parental preference as well as local catchment. So we always do consult with any local catchment school as well. And those schools do have 15 days to respond to the local authority. And if they've got any concerns or any questions, they can have that conversation again with the casework officer to address anything they want to discuss with us before we go ahead and make the decision about finalising. When we do finalise a plan with the educational placement, you know, if as a parent you don't think that's appropriate, you can go down the appeals process, or even at that point, if you think some of the wording you want to challenge, you can go down the appeals process even once the plan is finalised. Now, we always talk to SENCOs about these key steps to remember. So, you know, thinking about beginning of the year would be an ideal time for a SENCO in any school setting to look at the annual reviews within their school, and thinking about actually talking to the families about, you know, right, your child's annual review is due in, I don't know, February. You know, let's have a talk about your work patterns, you know, what would be an appropriate time for the family. So for some schools, they might actually set out right at the beginning of the year, the annual review dates, with collaboration with the families, talking to professionals as well as making sure at least 6 weeks prior to the review, they're requesting the advice, 4 weeks prior to the annual review, chasing that advice, 2 weeks before the review, making sure they send out all of the advice to everybody that will be attending, holding the review, and then sending it back to the local authority within 2 weeks.
One of the key messages that we really try and get across is that, you know, it's really should be a person-centered review. One of the other things is thinking about the child or young person, encouraging them to be at the review, trying not to book the annual review when it's their favourite lesson or something like that, preparing the child or young person for that annual review. So the preparation and getting that date in is really key, so that families, you know, it's a convenient time, you haven't got to worry about, you know, perhaps childcare for other children you may have, and as Michelle said, your working patterns. So, you know, it is really key to involve you as a family and make sure that it is at a convenient time, you know, as best as possible for everybody, because it's, you know, an annual review, it should really be able to sort of get everybody there at a convenient time, so that you can really focus on that child or young person that the annual review is for, and so that everybody's got that time in their diaries and prepared for it. So we really do sort of emphasize that with settings to make sure that they are involving everybody in that date and planning ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going to mention as well about, I think we've mentioned the consultation process a few times, and I'm not sure if people are massively familiar with what we mean by that, because it's sort of a process that's perhaps unique to our team. What the consultation means is that we send the child or young person's education and healthcare plan and any advices. So, for example, there might be a medical report or the latest annual review. All of that information will go to the setting. So we've talked about sort of secondary schools quite a bit, but it's just a good example for using. So if your child's going on to secondary school, you're looking at the next school that your child's going to go to, we'd send all that information to that school so they can really get a picture of the child or young person in that paperwork. And so that's really what the consultation process involves, us sending all that paperwork over to the setting for them to look through it.
Thank you, Rachel. So these next few slides, we're just going to go over each part just in a little bit more detail. That gathering advice, we did give a quote there from the Code of Practice. So you can see there it is part of the statutory process that SENCOs must be, looking at the outcomes specified in the EHC plan, gathering the advice and the views of other people. Sending the invites there, you can see directly from the Code of Practice, it does state at least 2 weeks before the date of the annual review. So it is in the statutory process that should be taking place. And like Rachel just said, this person-centred review, really talking to families, talking to the young people, it should be held in the style of a person-centred review. So even though the format of the meeting might change with different settings, they would all still need to be that child-centred. You can see there is a reference again to the Code of Practice. So it's talking about undertaken in partnership with the child and parents. And schools shouldn't actually be simply focusing on things that have gone on in the past year in school. This shouldn't feel like a parents' evening. This is very much different. The amount of documents that are completed as part of this, like we said earlier, the section L is the record of the meeting, the annotated plan. You've got all the professional advice, and I do apologise for the typing mistake there. We've got the views of the child or young person as well. These are all documents that should be sent in to the local authority and copies given to yourself. Step 5, we spoke about earlier, being that decision. The local authority will inform you within 4 weeks of the annual review meeting whether they will be making the amendments, whether they will be not making any amendments and going ahead and finalising, or whether they will be ceasing. Now, just to let you know, if the local authority feel that no amendments are needed, it doesn't mean to say that your annual review is not included in the EHCp, because all the section L, all the advices will become part of the Education, Health and Care Plan. But if we look at the annual review and actually there was no major changes made, it might have just been a few tweaks to, an outcome or a few minor changes to provision, then we would actually state that all the evidence, all the record of those suggested amendments are within the plan itself anyway. Okay, and we'll only be amending if there are significant changes. About certain circumstances where interim reviews might be needed, so early reviews. Just to let you know, we do talk to SENCOs about, before holding an interim review, it is good practice to hold a professionals meeting first. So, for example, if a school has found that the provision might not be working, and they might think, do you know what, we need to call an annual review quickly. What we would be saying is, hold that professionals meeting, talk to other professionals, get advice, then actually you might not need an annual review. If after that professionals meeting that you still feel an annual review is relevant to update the plan, or if the parents want to request that change of placement, then go ahead. But we do feel in Peterborough it's good practice to hold a professionals meeting first. If if the schools will be going ahead organising that interim reviews with families, we do remind schools that it is the normal annual process, the normal annual review process that will still apply. So we'd still be looking at gathering the advices, we'd still be looking at sending out the advices 2 weeks before the meeting. And the statutory process does not change if it's an early review. We'll just take a little bit of a break now, just to see if there's any questions, because we've looked at the guidance, we've looked at the timeframes. Next, we're just going to look at a few good pieces of practice that we show SENCOs and we talk to SENCOs about. But are there any questions so far in the presentation?
Yeah, I have one. It's Jason from the Voice. I'm a
Hello, Jason.
parent rep. Hi. Just a question. If you said earlier on that if a parent is or has a particular school that they want the child to go to, what happens if the SENCO or the local authority don't think that school is appropriate? What happens then? Because you didn't say.
Yeah, if the school, yeah, sorry, Jason. If the school itself that you've requested has concerns, they can talk to the local authority and we can provide support. So we might talk to them about, you know, getting hub involvement, which means additional advice to help them look at the provision that could be made within their school. If, for example, as a family you've asked for a special school and the local authority feel that the needs of the child can be met within mainstream school, we would be talking to the family about that decision, as well as then talking to that mainstream school about the additional support put in place and the additional, you know, professionals that can be involved in supporting that school meet the needs of the child.
And I've got another question on that. I know that able-bodied, if that's the right word, able-bodied children look round schools and they have to pick, or the parents have to pick which schools they want them to go to. Does that happen for SEN children or not? Do you know what I'm getting at or not? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the process of applying for schools would be different. For a child without an SEN EHCp, they would go through the normal process where they'd request their school through the local authority. With children with education, health and care plans, that's specifically dealt with by the statutory assessment and monitoring team for that local authority.
Right, okay.
You were breaking up a bit for me when you were speaking, Jason, so I didn't catch exactly what you said, but were you talking about actually going to visit schools just to sort of get a feel for them?
Hang on a minute.
I don't know if it's my connection or yours. Sorry, apologies.
I think the point to raise is really that children without education, health and care plans will go through the normal process where they apply for example, a secondary school. As we all are aware in this society, just because you apply for a secondary school doesn't mean to say you will get your parental preference. And I know currently on the forms, I think parents have to state three preferences, don't they? But when it comes to an education, health and care plan, it is different, and the process will be through the statutory assessment and monitoring service. And we do look at the forms that are completed after a family receives a notice of amends to see what their parental preference is.
I think what Jason was saying.
Invoice address, you know.
Oh, I'm not sure. That's not me. I think what Jason was saying was, you know, it comes to Oxford and our children go around mainstream schools and go and do a tour and do all that. What we do is we have to which school we'd like our children to go to and select it before we've even seen it a lot of the time. We would certainly be saying as families, you know, talk to the SENCOs, see if the SENCOs would offer a tour. I know pre-COVID, and my background is being a SENCO, I would naturally, you know, show parents around. During COVID, I'm not, you know, you need to talk to those individual schools, but definitely talking to the SENCOs about the provision
within their school, looking at their websites, looking at their SEND report as well, just to get a feel of the different provisions that they normally provide. But when it comes to an educational health and care plan, the school would be expected to provide all the provision laid out within that plan, and that's why we do have to actually consult with them to ensure that they can meet those needs and the provision within any plan.
Brilliant, thank you. I have another, it's not a question, it's more of a thing that I've noticed, and I never really appreciated this until I started looking at my own daughter's educational health and care plan. Your educational health and care plan is the only information that people have when they're reviewing and trying to help you decide which schools are going to. So it's really important that when you are putting information on about your children, it enables people who don't know your children to be able to imagine your children, what they can do, what they can't do, what they like and what they don't like, and how it's really important that you put as much information on there about your children to make sure that it's a personal document. And I didn't appreciate that until recently.
Yeah, you know, these are focused on the young people themselves, and the more information we have on those plans, for example, if we are doing a consultation and the school's expected just to look at the plan and the additional evidence within that plan, you know, it's really useful for them to have a really good picture of that young person that comes out of that document. And even if it goes to a panel, an SEND panel, if you have requested specialist school, you know, we need to make sure that SEND panel has access to, you know, the full picture of that young person, and that would be through the plan and all the other advices that are part of that document. So absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no other questions at this point, we'll move on, but we will stop again a bit later for any questions.
There is something in the chat.
Oh, Rachel, can you see the chat? Unfortunately, I can't see it because I'm presenting.
Yes, I can. So there's a question here that says, what should a parent do if a school isn't following the rules for the reviews, if they're not allowing the right timeframes to collect information, or if they're not doing those termly meets, who can we inform? So we would always, in the first instance, you know, sort of speak to your SENCO to say, well, actually, you know, has the information been collected? You know, it's well within your rights to ask a SENCO what information is being collected, to request those termly meetings. So I would say to try in-house in the school first. So go to the SENCO or the head, or if you've just got somebody, you know, familiar in that school that you feel you could go to just to ask that question. We would say kind of try with the school first. It may be that they've had a new SENCO or whatever. There's obviously lots of different circumstances. If you don't get anywhere from there, we would suggest looking to go to the SEND partnership for support. So many of you may sort of know Marion and Jackie, who work in the SEND partnership. So they support families, children with or without EHCPs. So it might be that they could support you to sort of challenge the school, to ask the SENCO about that. And obviously, if you're not getting anywhere or you haven't got anywhere from there, then I would say contact our team and let us know if you feel that that process isn't being followed. Then we would sort of take that from there.
Yeah, that was me that wrote that question. My name. I've got two now boys. Diagnosed. My youngest one just recently. He's in a mainstream school local to me. But no, it's my eldest one. We've been informed that we haven't got a SENCO at the school, and now we have no longer got a head teacher. We've got an interim head because the head teacher was sacked. The school I'm talking about was the school that got put in the Evening Telegraph.
Okay. I would say, I mean, obviously there's different scenarios, but certainly get in touch with either Marion and the SEND partnership in the first instance, or if not, come back. We've got a number of officers that are linked to that school, so please do get in.
He's been attacked 3 times at school now, which at point have involved the police. They've been quite that serious that the police have been involved, and because the school turned around and said to the police, without them even speaking to me first, because he's got language and communication delay on his plan, he wouldn't be able to tell you what's happened. So the police listen to the school rather than to us as parents. So there's no communication there at all with the school.
Okay. Well, obviously we don't want to get into too much detail.
Yeah.
Of children, don't want you to share it, you know, in this platform, but please do, yeah, get in touch with our team.
Right.
We can talk to you sort of outside this meeting. Yep. All right.
Yep, that's cool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next part of the presentation then, which is talking about, you know, the practice. So we just talk about different examples that SENCOs could use. You know, we've talked about prior to this, parents being involved in that discussion around times, you know, looking at, you know, working patterns, the best times for the families, not just professionals. So having that conversation well in advance of the annual review actually being booked, about all the information and reports gathered, you know, not just looking at advice from external professionals, but actually what advice is the school putting forward. It should be a written record that everybody gets to see prior to the meeting. Making sure the letters are appropriate and are detailed. And we are actually forming some example letters that were given to schools just to help them ensure that all the relevant information is included within those letters. Now, one of the questions that comes up quite a bit from SENCOs is, you know, should they be inviting the local authority offices to all the annual reviews? And we always say to them, please do inform us of any annual reviews. Generally, the SAMS officers would attend, but there are exceptions. For example, if it is a transition year group, then it might be one of your transition officers is there at the review. Or, for example, if it's a complex case, it might be that your SAMS officer might be in attendance, but it needs to be, you know, thinking about the purpose of that SAM officer being there. If, for example, it is a transition year group, it might be that your transition officer supports in doing some of the paperwork. They might actually do some of the annotations within the meeting to support the annual review. One of the things we talk about is obtaining the views of the parent and the young person. Now, Rachel really spoke about this earlier, talking about the importance of gathering the views of the young person and parents and making sure they're actually circulated with the advices. So everybody gets to know what those views are before the annual review meeting itself. Now, as we know with technology, and myself and Rachel have already found, you know, we're not familiar with Zoom, we're quite familiar with Teams, but every school is slightly different. So some schools might use the Teams meeting virtual tool, they might use Google Meet, they might use Zoom, or it might be a blended package. I've attended some reviews remotely over, you know, a virtual meeting, but parents have been within the school itself with the SENCO. You know, so there can be different ways of holding these reviews going forward. And I do think, you know, with technology nowadays, that is a positive. I know there's going to be glitches. I know there's going to be some technical sort of hiccups, but, you know, certain professionals that may not have been able to attend in the past because of the amount of appointments they had or workload, now actually might be able to join a virtual meeting, rather than spend, you know, 20, 30 minutes in a car getting to a school to be there in person. I see this actually as quite a positive. And at the moment, any SAMS officer, if they are invited and will be attending, will actually be attending virtually. Now, we keep talking about this advice, don't we, from professionals and schools. We provide an advice form that is given out to schools. Now, schools can send this advice form out to professionals. The professionals can put their advice on this form, or they might put it in a different format. That's up to them. But this is just an example of all the information that we're really after for the annual review. Schools can use this as well, or schools might have their own way of recording their information and circulating as advice. But we do provide the schools and professional support by having this form that they can complete for annual reviews. So just to make you aware of that. The meeting itself, we keep saying about, you know, this person-centered approach, and we go over with the schools about exactly what is in the code of practice. So chapter 9.177, if you do wish to have a look, this is actually a quote from there. So it talks about, you know, looking at the progress made towards those outcomes, whether they've achieved them, and looking at the rate of progress, you know, looking at whether the outcomes remain appropriate. And if they're not, actually, you know, putting in new outcomes. If there is a new need put into the plan, there should be a new outcome that meets that need. We need to make sure that any special educational provision and arrangements is reviewed. It might be that some provision is now not appropriate and needs to come out of the plan, and some new provision might need to be added. At any annual review, the health and social care provision and outcomes are reviewed, but they can only be amended if we've a health or social care professional. We always check about aspirations in the reviews, and we'll look a little bit later how, you know, aspirations really link in to the outcomes. But it's really important that we get the views from the young person and family about their aspirations, and really thinking about that preparing for adulthood. And we'll talk about that term a bit later on as well. There's always the option after an annual review to also request any personal budget, and a leaflet about personal budgets is always sent out to families with the paperwork. We always say about, you know, there's different ways of doing an annual review, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's virtual, whether it's blended. But all these reviews should be focused on the plan and the young person and family, not any issues that have happened over the last year. It should not feel like a parents' evening. This is reviewing the plan and the aspirations and outcomes. Just to remind people again, we spoke earlier about these outcomes are long-term to the end of the next key stage. You know, those smaller term outcomes, you know, what the child is working towards that specific year or that specific term should still be recorded, and you should still be talking to your SENCO termly, whether that's in the format of a parents' evening or an additional meeting. But the annual review itself is really looking at those long-term outcomes and their journey towards meeting them. One of the things we do sort of ask SENCOs to consider is, you know, do families know how to access all these different technology and virtual meetings? You know, and if not, sitting with them, just explaining things or giving them out information about how to join a Teams meeting or a Zoom call, you know, just to make sure that they have access to the technology and the support that's needed for any kind of virtual meeting. One of the things we say as well is about the documents. Now, if you're all sitting around in a meeting, the SENCO might be providing, you know, copies of the Education, Health and Care Plan for everybody to be able to see and to be able to physically, you know, flick the page and have a look. In a virtual meeting, obviously that's more difficult. So we talk about, you know, the benefits of sharing a screen like we're doing today. And it might be that the SENCO shares the Education, Health and Care Plan on the screen and goes through it. So you can see the annotations. So once you've had that discussion about what needs changing, what the proposed changes are, you can physically see the SENCO actually make those changes and agree or discuss a bit further. We talk about putting cameras on. At the beginning of this meeting, myself and Rachel had our cameras on. We've turned them off currently just to help with the connection, but we will be turning them back on at any discussion points. It's quite hard for some people, and I find it hard actually talking to a blank screen. It's a lot easier talking to people face to face. So we need to think about moving forward how we do that. Checking who is able to attend in person, if it is an in-person meeting, or whether they would prefer virtual. So even as a school, if you're actually offering to have the meeting within school, parents might want to have that discussion and say, do you know what, I would rather attend virtually. You know, just having that open discussion now. I said a second ago that the SAMS offices are currently working virtually only. If that changes in the future, then we'll talk to SENCOs about that. But currently, we are only attending virtually. And those wider SENI services, based on the risk assessments, they might be able to attend in person, or they might actually be, you know, it might be safer to actually attend virtually. if you're looking at a professional that might be going to different schools to do observations, they might be seen as, you know, at risk of passing on COVID to different settings. So we just need to think about risk assessments there. Really important, like we keep saying, about views of the child or young person. Now, it might be difficult to get the views of the young person if they're non-verbal, but actually they can still give their views. We still have lots of different ways that children communicate, and you can look at what they're enjoying, what they're actually doing, what they're making. The parents might feel, you know, the child might feel more comfortable talking to the parents to get their views and present it at the annual review. But we always talk about this importance of giving the child the opportunity right the way from the early ages to attend part of their review or all of their review. And I know that's something we'll go on to in a minute. This one, Rachel, now I know you actually did this sample, didn't you? I think you took 30 random plans to actually look at the participation of the young people. Rachel, do you want to just say what you actually found when you did this? Because I think it was quite surprising to start with, wasn't it?
So what we were sort of looking at was actually, you know, what age groups are children coming to their reviews, you know, particularly looking at post-16 when we want to sort of encourage preparing for adulthood, making sure that, you know, colleges or wherever that young person may be, that they are making the review, you know, somewhere that, you know, a child would want to go to or a young person would want to go to. So getting settings to think about, you know, where are they holding the review? Is that going to be in a comfortable place? So we just sort of looked at some random plans just to see if children and young people had attended, and if they hadn't attended, what might have been the reasons for that. So as you can see, we had a bit of a mixture across sort of the age groups and things, and we understand that, you know, some annual reviews, if you've been to one yourself, you might know they can be sort of an hour and a half, 2 hours, so they're quite long meetings. So we understand that, you know, some children and young people wouldn't necessarily want to sit through one for, you know, a review for that long, but we would definitely want them to give their views. So it's about trying to get Senkos to think, well, actually, maybe they could come in for half an hour, talk about, you know, what they think's going well, if they're able to do so. So really thinking about how a child or young person gives their views in a real sort of individual way. So thinking about that person as an individual and what ways they might be able to contribute. And we're going to show some examples as we go along. But it's really sort of making sure that we're able to sort of challenge, you know, why didn't that young person come? I said before as well about making sure the review's not in their favourite lesson, because a lot of, you know, if people want to be in their lessons, they don't necessarily want to come out of their favourite lesson to be in an annual review which might not be their favourite thing. So it's really important to, you know, at least give families, you know, that talk through about whether they think their child might like to come, how it might work best, because every child's needs are unique to them, so it's a really individual thing. And I think there was a message in the chat, Michelle, Jason had asked, what do you do if the young person can't speak? How do we capture the views? So I think, are we going to give some examples next about some of the forms and things that settings?
Yes, we do have a few examples, I think. Okay, so I'm just going to skip to the next slide. 2 seconds. Now having IT problem. Yeah, there we go. Okay, some examples. These are examples from Senkos within Peterborough that they currently are using, and that's going really well. So for some Senkos, they actually complete forms with the young person. So at a time that's appropriate for this, they might take the child out, they might do it within a lesson, it might be done with a teacher, it might be done with a TA. But again, they try and think about, you know, what they like, what they don't like, do they have any worries, and give them that chance to express their views. The young person then might want to actually present this at the meeting. I've also seen really good examples where young people, based on this information, have actually presented a PowerPoint. So it's been recorded prior to the meeting and shown, as well as actually I've seen a young person do a live PowerPoint presentation from the room next door to where the annual review was being held, just because they felt more comfortable doing it that way. So they were part of the review, but they weren't actually in the room. So there are different ways of doing it, different ways to consider. Goals, dreams and aspirations. We always want to know what the child's aspirations are. One school uses this lovely example of 3 wishes for the future, and the child actually draws in here what they want to wish, or they can write, or they can get an adult to scribe. But it's that idea, these are 3 wishes, and young people love that idea. It's all about being creative and knowing that young person. So like you said, if the child is non-verbal, the TA might still really know that child really well and understand what their favourite subject is, how they best learn, what they find difficult, what the trigger points are. So it could be through an adult, if a child is non-verbal, that we get the child's views and aspirations. And something that we're still finding in the local authority on the front of the plan, some plans are still blank. There is specifically a box on the front of every plan to represent that young person. Now that could be a photograph. Some families do choose to put the school photograph on there. It could be a cartoon character. It could be anything that the young person at that time feels is important to them. Could be a drawing they've done that they're really proud of. So if a child is, for example, non-verbal, you might still know from that child something they've done that they like, that they want to actually keep looking at, that they, you know, were really proud of, even though they might not be able to verbally say it. That could be taking a picture and put on the front of the plan. Some plans might have their pets, you know, a photograph or a drawing of a pet, or anything that means something to that young person. What we don't want is to see these plans that when you first look at them just don't seem that personal. You know, that box is there for a reason. This is actually their plan. Okay, so that should be instantly something that represents them right on the front of the plan itself. If you've got a child in a review, you know, whether they're there for the whole thing or whether they're there just for half hour, 15 minutes, you know, however long they're there, you know, really thinking about, you know, maybe closing that part of the review with things that maybe everybody around the table is really proud of. And this is just one example of what we have seen, where a Senko goes round everybody at the meeting and just asks them to state one thing that they are proud of. And the young person can leave the meeting with memories of that conversation that's just happened. Really nice way of closing the annual review for a young person. We're going to have a quick look at this sectionale, because we always talk about sectionale, but this is actually the new sectionale that's just been released. This was released last term, so some of you may not have seen it. You might have seen the old sectionale. It is very similar to the old sectionale. The only addition to the new sectionale format is that we do record now whether the school has asked for the advice from Education, Health and Social Care, whether they've actually received the advice, and whether it was circulated 2 weeks before the review. Now, we know there might be some circumstances where a school has only received let's just give an example of a health advice a week before the review. Maybe the professional couldn't get it to the school in time. So we would still be expecting that advice to be circulated, but it might not be 2 weeks before the review, and we want that recorded in here. So we do ask the school, if it's not circulated, can you just tell us why? What are the reasons? When we talk to schools about annotating the plan, it's really important that you know that any additions to the plan is in bold. Anything that the school is, as a family, you are proposing is taken out of the plan, has a line through it, so we use strike through. Schools and families, please be aware, do not delete any of the text boxes. It's really important for us when we're processing the paperwork to know what your suggestions are, what you're proposing. We need to know what you're proposing is added and taken out. And we do check, we do have all the different documents open, and we will then make that decision about what the annotations are. We have seen some examples of schools using different colours. It's not needed. It can just be strike through or bold, and we will process the paperwork. we talked to Senkos about, just a couple of top tips. We do make sure that people are aware that you can't add any health conditions unless it's backed up by a report or an advice. So we need to see that diagnosis on a letter, an official advice letter, to be able to make any amendments to the plan. Do not name specific people delivering provision. It's not needed. We don't need to know that, the name of the TA that's delivering the speech and language programme within school. We don't need to know the speech and language therapist's name. It needs just to state, who will be delivering in school with regards to, is it the Senko? Is it an external service? We don't need to know the names. And any amendments to social care or health outcomes can only be done if we have a relevant report from those professionals. Now, we've already said that schools have 2 weeks to get the paperwork to us. This is the email that can be used by the schools. This is the email that any parent can use as well to contact the service. It's the sen@peterborough.gov.uk email address. So all documents will be received by our admin team. And after the review, Senko should be sharing a survey with you that has been created by the local authority. The Senkos have that link, and we'll be talking to Senkos more about that in the future, because it's really important for us that we know your experiences and your feedback based on the annual review experience itself from your point of view. So we really do want that feedback. And just to let you know as well, we talked to Senkos about this is a totally secure email. We do not need documents password protected at all. This is an absolutely secure email to send documents across. And just to let you know as well, any documents that are sent out to families from the local authority are separately checked 3 times, at least 3 separate people from the SAMS team, from the Statutory Assessment Monitoring Service, check documentation before it's sent out. We said earlier in that overview that the local authority has 4 weeks after the annual review to actually contact you to talk to you about, the local authority's decision, whether to cease, to make the amendments or to make no amendments. Okay, you can see there the quote from the Code of Practice. So you do have the right to appeal any decisions, the requirement for them to consider mediation if they decide to appeal. All that is included within documentation sent out by the local authority. And if you have any concerns, you can contact the SEND Partnership Service as well. So that's Jackie Pluckrose and Marion Dealey. We touched upon this earlier slightly, the fact that we'll only be looking at amending the plan if there are significant changes. The Code of Practice does say that it's not expected to require frequent changes and updates. We are looking really at the key transition points. So we're amending the plan based on changing the next set of outcomes for the end of the next key stage. But if there are any significant changes of need, any medical changes with appropriate reports and evidence, then that might lead to a change before those transition points. Just skip that last bit. So if we're talking about any kind of new diagnosis, we'll be expecting evidence. But if we add any kind of new need within the plan, so it'd be evidenced in section B of the Education, Health and Care Plan, we would be expecting a new outcome to meet that need. Okay, just to make you aware of that. Right, so another opportunity here for any questions based on that. It might feel like we're going over the same thing again. When we're talking to Senkos, we just provided that brief overview to start with in that first part of the PowerPoint. Then we went into examples, just talking about different things that they could do practically. And the next section will really go over just a few bits of the statutory process around, the different sections of the Education, Health and Care Plan, something called Preparing for Adulthood that we did touch upon earlier. So the next bit will just go over just key little things. But are there any questions before we move on? Rachel, is there anything else you think we've missed?
I put a couple of things in the chat. If anyone. So,
Rachel, thank you, Jason. Rachel, if you can just let me know what the chat.
So Jason's just put about having a new condition should be part of the new review, regardless if there is no documents, especially if it's going to be long-term health issue, especially if it's been diagnosed the day before, for instance, as I know paperwork can't be that quick. So yeah, that's a really good point, Jason. And often parents and families might get that information verbally. So if you've been and had an assessment for something, somebody, you know, a paediatrician or somebody from the neuro team have fed something back. But as you said, there won't necessarily be anything in writing that quickly. But as Michelle was saying, we need that sort of evidence and something in writing from the NHS or whoever's done that assessment. So one thing that we do always say is if a family have got confirmation of that sort of a letter, then give that to the school to copy. That's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to come directly sort of from a health professional, as long as it's sort of on NHS headed paper or whatever, and then that's okay for families to pass on that information. We really encourage that actually, to make sure that, you know, schools, and that's outside of reviews as well. Obviously, your setting need to know all the updates about your children and young people. So yeah, I think they're the sort of times when the annual review, if things come through outside of that, they can be medical reports can be added in, and we would really encourage Senkos to be getting that information and making sure that they sort of take on board that advice throughout outside that annual review.
there is a reason why I actually put that in the chat. I have, and I'm going back 50 years nearly now, but I have a condition called hydrocephalus, which for people who don't know what it is, it's in layman's terms, it's fluid on the brain. And I know sometimes in children it can be diagnosed later than in birth time or at birth. So I'm aware it's not always relevant, or it's not. So yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking more of myself rather than where
yeah,
for something. So that was all. That's
why
I was. Go on.
That's why you were bringing it up. That makes sense.
Yeah.
One thing we would always say is not to think of a massive emphasis on diagnosis, because actually an EHCp really focuses on a child or young person's needs. So section B of the Education and Healthcare Plan is split into those 4 areas. So you've got communication, learning, social, emotional, mental health. And really what we want is for everybody that knows that child or young person to be given information on their needs. So in terms of sort of diagnosis, obviously some health reports are really, really useful, especially if it's sort of therapists that are working closely with children. But we would always look at needs as well. So that's really part of the EHCP, not just looking at what a diagnosis is, looking at that child as an individual and what their special educational needs are, if you like.
Yeah, but going on the educational side of things, when you have, I mean, you may have a child prior to having a diagnosis like hydrocephalus, who is very good at certain things. Once he gets diagnosis of hydro, their concentration can differ from prior. So and things like that, and how quickly they are at learning and how they learn. So yeah, that's what I was really trying to think. I was thinking, what could happen rather than what should happen.
Yeah, got ya. Thank you. That's a really good point.
Okay, so we'll move on if there are no other questions. This links in actually nicely with what you were just saying, Rachel, about, you know, the section B is all those new needs. This just gives you an overview of the different sections within the Education, Health and Care Plan. So you'll be fully aware that, you know, section A is the families part, which talks about the aspirations. So this is not really for the school to have the input in. This is a family section which talks about what your views are, what the child's views are. So those aspirations, the likes, you know, the things the child might find difficult, you know, the interests, the family circumstances can be recorded in here. Okay, so that's not for the school to really dictate what is in there. That is for you as a family. Section B, like Rachel just said, is really focusing on those needs. So that's a discussion with all the professionals and family and young person about what the needs of that young person are. Section C, just talk about, you know, the health conditions. So that might be where the medical diagnosis, if there are any, would be written in, again, with the medical evidence. Section D talks about the social care needs. So if social care provide reports, then we can add things in there. Again, that is only for social care to have the input in there. Section E is the outcomes. So we're looking at those longer term outcomes, preferably by the end of the next key stage. So for example, if you're in primary, it might say by the end of key stage 1, key stage 2. If you're in secondary, it would then move up to key stage 3 and key stage 4. Section F is focusing on that provision to meet the needs of the child that's been listed in B. Section G is talking about the health provision. So again, we would need the reports from health professionals to talk about what is put in that section. H1 and H2 again must link to that section D. So if we have external reports, then we can add things in there. Section I is about the school placement. Section J is about any kind of budget. So if there is a personal budget, it would be written in there. So, and you will have a section at the end of each plan talking about all the different advices over the years since the plan was written, and that would be detailed as an appendix. So you'd have section K with a list of all the different reports, all the section Ls that have come in over the years. When we're talking about end of key stage outcomes, we always talk to SENCOs about making sure that they are SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timely. And we talk about them linking the outcomes to the needs and aspirations. So making sure they are all linked, and we call that link the golden thread. So this idea of the golden thread is something that links a child or young person to their aspirations, which links to the needs and the outcomes to support achieve their aspirations. We talk to SENCOs about, you know, the long-term goal, and those smaller steps might be recorded by the school, but the outcomes within the plan are long-term, and we need to make sure they are really observable, so they can be easily measured. We want for them to avoid these vague terms like, oh, the child needs to know or remember. No, we want them to be really smart, measurable outcomes. And we give SENCOs some examples. So just to give, you know, the first example here, it says to independently put on and take off his Velcro fastened shoes and sports socks for PE on 4 out of 5 occasions so that he can develop independence in personal care skills. So that's linked to the aspirations and the need of the child, and it's made the outcome really smart, really measurable. Now, we always try and say on 4 out of 5 occasions or 90% of the time, because as every adult knows, there are going to be some days where we just can't do something. You know, there are some days where I struggle to put my socks on and put my shoes on, you know, so just making it measurable and realistic. So that's why we say 4 out of 5 occasions. And we give an example there, secondly, about vocabulary, you know, to be able to name 5 objects used in the classroom in the one-to-one session with a known adult 3 times a week to develop their expressive language skills. We just give them lots of different outcomes that can meet different needs. Okay, so we try and actually give practical examples for SENCOs to look at. Mentioned earlier about this word preparing for adulthood, often abbreviated as PFA. There are 4 pathways for preparing for adulthood: employment, independent living, community inclusion and health. There's a link in the document that we give SENCOs so they can look at a document that details each one and the outcomes that could be used to meet the 4 pathways. The There is an expectation if the child is year 9 and above to have, for a year 9 child, to have at least one preparing for adulthood outcome. In year 10, at least 2, and for year 11, at least 3. But we always talk to SENCOs about the fact that you can have preparing for adulthood outcomes right the way from the early years. So if you're working with a child on, for example, getting dressed, like we said, well, that's independent living. That's helping them. If you're looking at cleanliness, that would come under health. So I would actually argue that every child should have PFA outcomes within their plans, and you can really link them in quite easily. We talked to SENCOs about something called an annual health check. Now, I don't know if parents here are aware of this, but all young people aged 14 and above with a diagnosed learning disability can access an annual health check from their GP practice. Now, we are now encouraging SENCOs to remind parents at the annual review and just to check whether that child has had an annual health check and does qualify. If you're not sure if the child qualifies, you can just phone up the GP practice, because GPs do have a list of anybody diagnosed with a learning disability. So the term learning disability is slightly different to special educational needs. So it is worth checking whether your child, if they are above 14, does qualify for this. We spoke earlier about those transition years and, you know, key deadlines. This is something we gave to SENCOs right at the beginning of the year, and I think it was important to actually keep this in the presentation so you can see that we are expecting SENCOs to do things by certain times. So, for example, the year 2s in infant school, we asked them for all reviews to be held by the 22nd of October so that we had time to process the paperwork and ensure they had their next placement named on their plan before the 15th of February. For the year 5s, we asked for additional reviews to happen in the summer term. For that reason, when they started year 6, we would then be processing and seeking a secondary school placement to be able to then finalise before the 15th of February. Year 11s, we asked for all annual reviews to be completed by the 22nd of October again. They have a slightly different phase transfer deadline at the 31st of March. But again, it gives the local authority time to process, contact the parents, and then seek that next educational placement. Now, last year, our data for meeting those transition deadlines was really good. You can see their year 2s, 100%. Year 6s, 97% of plans were finalised with their secondary school placement, and the year 11s, 93%. Now, we always aspire to actually get 100%, but as everybody is aware, there might be some cases where parents are taking time, or they might be actually looking at different placements. But we felt that was really useful to actually show SENCOs, you know, how much work SENCOs have put into organising those annual reviews and how the local authority has responded to that and processed the paperwork. Now, I know Family Voice do have a feedback form, so I've just left that in there just to remind people. But at the end of the presentation, there are a few slides, just additional slides, which I'm not really going to go over, but just to let you know that, you know, the local offer is a working document, so we would love to actually hear from people if they do have any feedback about the local offer. And there's a list of resources at the end. Now, can I just ask Family Voice, is the presentation going to be shared with parents?
Yes, so it's the actual presentation. I believe we can share that, definitely, and the whole presentation this morning is recorded, so that'll be put on YouTube as well. That's
fine, thank you. I just wanted to check because there was a list of resources just at the end, you know, different documents to look at that we do give out to SENCOs. So one of them being, you know, the Teams virtual meeting document. We've got a key terms document, and things like the semi-structured chart, which is really useful for families to know, as well as schools and settings, our contact details, the details about the personal budgets that we spoke about earlier, so that's the link to the leaflet, and about the SEND partnership service, as well, actually, right at the end, about Family Voice. But are there any questions then? I'll just go to the question one.
We haven't got any others in the chat, but if people would prefer to write them in the chat, that's absolutely fine. We can pick those up from there. If you'd rather not sort of put your mic on and speak, we're happy to pick them up in the chat.
Hopefully you have found it useful seeing, you know, what we do talk to SENCOs about, because, you know, I think it was mentioned earlier that, you know, what happens if you feel that the statutory process isn't being followed? You know, if you have this knowledge, if you're aware of the statutory process, that will then spark off those conversations with those SENCOs. And it might be, like I think Rachel mentioned earlier, that the SENCO might be new to school. There might be some, you know, issues around timescales. They might not be aware of certain things. So actually having the knowledge yourselves will help you with that conversation with the school. And if you have any concerns, there are routes to go down through the SEND Partnership Service, or you can contact the local authority yourself. But there's also the school's complaints procedures that you can actually go down as well if you do have those concerns about a school meeting the statutory process. I believe we have a hand up, but I can't see who it is.
I can't see anything here. Oh, Yvonne. Yvonne's got a question, I think.
Yvonne, do you have a question? Okay, is there any questions from anybody else that we can answer? Because I think we've still got about 4 minutes left officially of the time allocated, haven't we?
It looks like that's about it then, really.
Okay, well, we'll stay around. I'll put my camera on for a second. We'll be here for the next few minutes anyway then, until the end of the session. But if you do have any questions, please do just put it in the chat or put your mic on. And I can see Katie's just joined us. I don't know how long you've been in the meeting, Katie.
Can I ask? Apologies, I've been here about half an hour, so yeah, apologies for being late today.
Hi there, my name's Rachel. I just want to ask a quick question. I just wondered, you know, as a parent carer, if you feel a bit overwhelmed with the whole kind of procedure and kind of a little bit lost, is it best? I mean, obviously, I try going to the school and asking for more information, and they're not got the best communication, and it's not as transparent as I would hope. Who's the best person to go to sort of get assistance? Would it be through SAMS?
We've got the SEND Partnership Service, so you've got Marion Dealey and Jackie Pluckrose that can be contacted. You can come directly to your SAMS officer if there is something particular that you want to discuss with us, if you have any of those concerns. But we'd obviously be promoting talking to the school first and the SEND Partnership Service.
I would echo what Michelle has just said there, but definitely the SEND Partnership Service are there to give you sort of impartial advice. There's sort of that nice link between sort of the school, the family and the local authority, so they can really make you aware of how things should be running for you.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's when you're not sort of aware of your rights and you sort of feel, I sort of feel like it's not that I feel completely unsupported. It's more of a case of I don't know what I'm allowed to ask or what you know, what my rights and position is as a parent.
Yeah.
You know, when you don't know the right questions to ask.
No, and you don't know what you don't know either, do you? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but also you might find some, you know, some useful information as well on the local offer, the Peterborough local offer. I don't know whether you ever sort of look at, you know, any other sort of forums outside of Family Voice, like Special Needs Jungle or anything like that, that's there to support families. So you can generally get some good sort of advice from or information from those kind of websites as well.
Oh, so brilliant. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. Thank you so much.
Michelle, I don't know if you want to put the slide back to partnership.
Yeah, no problem.
Leave that on the screen, just if anybody wants to just have a read of that and take any details, maybe.
Good point.
And you know as well, if you I mean, there's only 2 of them, as you know, in the SEND Partnership Service, but I know that they do go in with parent carers sometimes to annual reviews or meetings in school if they feel that the family feels that they need some specific support. Obviously, they can't go to all of them because there's 2 of them, but you know, I know that they have done that in the past. So if you've really felt that you needed a person with you, they can do that. They support you. They're not advocates, but they are they're able to support you and, you know, and back you up sometimes if you need it.
And I think in annual reviews as well, if you have that discussion with your SENCO about who you want inviting, it might be that you want to invite a family friend or somebody that you feel comfortable with being in the meeting as well. So have those discussions. Any other questions?
There's Yvonne's question in the chat. Her question is, college tell me they don't give copies of targets and how plan to achieve. Is that correct?
So the overall targets would be the overall outcomes would be in the education, health and care plan. So you're kind of thinking more of sort of the IEP version of the targets within that setting. So they're probably saying to you they don't give copies of targets because, I don't know, they may have something in place within that sort of post-16 world of wanting to sort of have that is very much around the learner experience, and being as the students are over 16 is probably more a discussion with them in a tutor time around what their sort of their small targets look like, and the support that's in place. And I think that's difficult. I mean, I don't know, Yvonne, sort of your personal situation, how old your son or daughter is. It's quite a contrast, isn't it, from school to college setting. Are they only just sort of new to college, or have they been there a long time?
I'm not sure if Yvonne's still here in the chat. I can't see her. Let me just look at participants.
See, it is an interesting point, isn't it? Because once they're in post-16, it's the young person themselves that, you know, the plan belongs to them. And so any correspondence from the local authority would be going naturally to that young person directly.
And I think it is a change of culture, isn't it? Because as a parent, you know, if there's any issues, you pick up the phone and you speak to someone at school, and they go to college, you know, and you've got that you've got that open relationship with the school where you can say, well, I know the SENCO, I speak to the SENCO or the deputy SENCO or the TA regularly, or the, you know, class teacher, whatever. And I think when your son or daughter goes to college, it is very different, and it's quite hard to get used to that is not necessarily the same levels of communication. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that.
My daughter's now in secondary school, and we all can already appreciate the lack of the relationship between us and the teachers and the SENCOs, because you're just not popping in at the end of the day picking the kids up. It's not building a relationship up anymore, and a lot of, like you say, a lot of the communication has to come via the child. So you are just not building that regular relationship. And I've got to look forward to her going to do her options, and we've had nothing come through at all. So it is just a case of understanding that this is how secondary schools are.
It's just different, isn't it? And you know, it's not a bad thing necessarily that gap widens, but I think it's your expectations, isn't it? Because like you say, Laura, when you're popping in and picking up at the end of school at primary, you can just have those chats in the playground, can't you? Or just say to the teacher, can I just pop in and have 5 minutes? And that doesn't, you don't get that in secondary, do you? And then in post-16, obviously it is more about, you know, as Michelle was saying, sort of the, you know, the student taking more responsibility for actually you know, you don't need mum on the end of a phone, and it's really hard as a mum, isn't it, not to go, I want to pick the phone up to sort this. You know, and it also depends on your child or young person's particular special educational need. And some, you know, some students will need a lot more support from home, and I know colleges are open to that. They are, you know, they're pretty good at that side of things, but it's just opening that communication up, I think.
And it is that preparing for adulthood, isn't it? We're looking at that, you know, developing that independence. Like we said earlier, with young people attending their reviews, you know, at primary school, the parents might feel that actually it's not appropriate for their child to attend, but get it from an early age. By the time they get to secondary, they'll be quite sort of comfortable attending annual reviews, expressing their views, and then moving on, you know, preparing for adulthood into that post-16 where they are in charge of their plan.
And I think that's the key bit, Michelle, that any child or young person needs to be aware of their plan wherever possible and involved in their plan. It's their plan. It's you know, the information in there is some of it can be quite sensitive, and you know, and it's obviously confidential, and they need to own that and be aware that these meetings happen. And yeah, you might be able to come to some of it, and you might be able to come to all of it. But the key thing is, in which you mentioned earlier, is having that voice. You know, and I've been to reviews before, not locally, I don't think, where we've had videos of a young person who sort of set up their own. I mean, you mentioned a PowerPoint, but it's videos of them doing various things. And it was actually in Manchester, and it was a really, really nice annual review. And when we got in there, the young person had chosen sort of the music that they like, and the music was on in the room, and they were in there, and it was really around them saying, look, I want the room set out like this, I want this music on, and it just to help them feel a little bit sort of more relaxed, and actually that is their meeting and we were invited to it. And then he showed this PowerPoint and video, and this young man was non-verbal, but they showed all of this, and he was able to sort of demonstrate what he liked and what his aspirations were, what he wanted to do after he left that particular placement, and all the things that were going really well for him. It was really, really nice that he'd got such a different way to express his views and for everyone to see. And we would not have seen him doing the things he'd done by just sitting in a meeting and someone chatting about it or reading about it. So it was a really, really good experience. And I'd always encourage any kind of input into a review, whether it's through video, whether it's through writing, whether it's through chatting, whether it's through PowerPoint or whatever, drawings, anything, any kind of input that a child or young person can give is essential. You've already said all of that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I've got an awful lot out of this morning, and hopefully everyone here attending has too. If there's anything else anybody'd like to add, I think we'll call it a day. You can send anything that you'd like us to promote to Family Voice, and we can make sure that's circulated. I think Ramu will be letting everybody have a QR code so we can offer any feedback. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you, Rachel, Michelle, Katie, and everybody who came along this morning, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks all. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.